Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and today I'm here with Helen Demetriou. Hi, Helen. Thank you for joining me.
Hello.
Yeah,
Pleasure.
you're in the Faculty of Education of the University of Cambridge, and as a research and teaching associate. Is that right? So I
That's
got
right.
that right?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, and the reason we're talking is you've been studying empathy, and there was a recent paper you did on empathy and creativity in education. Paper was titled "Empathy is the Mother of Invention, Emotion, and Cognition for Creativity in the Classroom." So, do you want to say anything else just in terms of introducing yourself, just before we really dig into it?
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Edwin. So yes, as you said, I'm Helen. I'm in Cambridge at the Faculty of Education. But my interest in empathy actually stems way back, and I've realised now it's about 30 years ago now.
Wow.
When I first started on my PhD journey, and that's when my first interest and encounter with empathy started. I actually researched the degree to which young children, toddlers, but also children in their middle childhood years were able to empathise with their peers in distress. So that was the focus of my PhD, and that started my interest in it. And even though I moved from London, that was back in London when I did that, at King's College at the Institute of Psychiatry, having left there and come to Cambridge, even though I researched in a number of different areas that touched on educational issues, empathy was never far away. So I realized that it's something that's clearly there in my subconscious that I obviously needed to explore in various guises. And what I've discovered is that, firstly, through my PhD, is that young children are very able to do it at very young ages. And we know that we're born with a certain amount of empathy. It's a very recent genetic study has shown that there is a certain proportion of it in our genes. What we also know, though, is that we can lose it fairly early on, and if we don't use it. So I want to say, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that can be taught. And it's not only been shown to be taught recently, but I could go on, there's a wonderful study way back in 1968 by Jane Elliott, the brown eye, blue eye study, which people may be familiar with, which shows how it can be taught and how it can overcome prejudice in the case of that study. So that's over the course of these last, I want to say, 20 plus years, I've been at the Faculty of Education, where my research has mainly been in areas of education for various government and various bodies. But all the time, as I said before, empathy has never really been very far away, and culminated in a book I wrote in 2018, Empathy, Immersion and Education. But also, as you've said correctly, in this very recent study with my colleague Bill Nicol, where we looked at creativity, how in the classroom can we measure creativity? That's something that's a very elusive construct in its own right as well. But also, can creativity be measured, and can empathy be taught? And in this instance, the research took place in the design and technology classroom at secondary school.
So how did you get started with empathy? Do you remember how you kind of came across the term, and was there sort of a moment of insight, or was it just kind of slowly evolved, or how did that kind of get started way back with your PhD or whatever?
Yes, I think that's a really good question. No, what happened there, I do remember now. I started thinking that I wanted to study cooperation in young children. So how far can young children cooperate? The concept of a social skill like cooperation. I wanted to understand how much toddlers, and in this, I was looking at 18-month-olds, I think it was to about 36-month-olds, looking to see how far I was thinking they could do something, a social skill such as cooperation. But my supervisor we looked at the literature together, and we saw there was a lot of literature already existing on cooperation, albeit still obviously a very interesting concept. And it was actually, I'm sure, my supervisor's idea, who said, how about empathy? What about the concept of empathy? There's not a lot in the literature going on in terms of how far and wide children can do it. What about if you focus on that as a concept? And that's how it started. So I got down to thinking about what it was, what definitions I would use for it to focus on for my research. And yes, that's how it all started.
Oh, what your study there reminded me of a video I'd seen of a study. I thought it was from Germany, where they had little toddlers, and then someone's like struggling with some books or something, and they're trying to open it, and a door, and they can't do it. Then the toddler goes up and opens the door for them. Are you familiar with that study or?
I'm not quite. That sounds amazing. There are other very similar studies and classic ones that go way back. I would say, yes, so 20s, 30s. But that is really nice. And you need to ask yourself as the researcher, what is the young person understanding? Obviously, the perspective of the other person, understanding therein they need some help, and then then going ahead and doing something. So I had similar scenarios. I remember during my PhD so they were videos of children who I was then analysing. And there was one particular scene where there was a child outside. They were both outside, the two young children. One of them was on a wall, and they were clearly a little bit unsettled and unsure of themselves. They were standing on this wall quite precariously. And the other child, and you could say, is it to relieve the distress because they are empathizing with the peer, pushes them off the wall. Now, are they thinking on the one hand, I really want to help you, and look, I'm helping you get off the wall, albeit quite, pushing, or are they just feeling, oh, look, you're really annoying me and I'm just going to push you off because then hopefully you'll stop crying? I mean, what was behind that motivation for them pushing that person off the wall? So it's very important as psychologists, as researchers, to know, especially with young children, pre-verbal, for example, who can't explain what it was they did, to try and understand whether there are early origins of what we call empathy going on there.
Well, how did your sort of understanding evolve from those, your first studies to the present of empathy? Can you maybe share a little bit of your journey from then till now?
Sure. So, so that journey, which then went from London to Cambridge, and where I found myself in researching with people who were looking into various issues that related to education, from boys' underperformance in modern languages, to dips in various year groups, to what children think is fair and unfair in the classroom and during school, what helps them in their learning. But all these studies, what actually, I would say, the common denominator for these studies was that we were always talking to children to get their understanding of what they were experiencing. And what that showed me was that by talking to them, and what we called then pupil voice, which a colleague, Edwin Rutsch, coined way back, was very important. So how we listen to them is very important in its own right for their learning. It empowers children, and it's by us taking time to understand and empathize with the children in order then to gather their ideas about their learning in these instances, that they feel empowered and they're able to tell us about themselves.
So are you saying that you found that by listening to the children, just by hearing what was going on for them, that was improving their sort of understanding and their own learning and their...
Absolutely. Okay. Even that sort of simple, if you like, communication and in its own right was having an impact on their learning. Those studies showed, but other studies that just involved talking to them in order to understand other things as well on top of it showed that they were able to tell us a lot about themselves. But it was only when, and this is the case, of course, for everyone growing up with parents, teachers, if somebody pays an interest to you and they invest time by empathizing themselves towards you, then you as a person will understand that, appreciate that, feel empowered. Your self-esteem is obviously, increases, and you feel like you understand the mechanism that is empathy going on. So absolutely, it was happening even within those studies and the ways in which we were actually conducting those studies.
So it's like the attention, like you're giving attention. So giving attention and empathy are sort of two really,
Absolutely.
sounds like really positive effects.
Absolutely. And also there was another study that we conducted over the years with my colleague Elaine Wilson, where we looked at teachers who we were concerned that there were teachers leaving the profession at very early points in their careers, having invested a lot of time and energy to become teachers. And we wanted to understand why. And what we found there in that study was it was the teachers that took time to understand their pupils, their learners, and these were secondary school science teachers. These are the ones that actually were able to get results from their children because they spent the time empathizing, understanding their perspective. And then those were the teachers that stayed on in teaching. So empathy showed itself in so many guises within the different forms of the research I've undertaken over the years. And as we know, it's just very important we know in psychology, through theories such as attribution theory, for example, where it's very important to try and understand the situation of the person that you're confronted with. It's not just instantly trying to give a label based on the disposition, the person themselves. Why are they acting in the way they're acting? It could be to do with the situation that's affecting them. And this is what the teachers who took the time to understand the learners were able to do. And those were the successful teachers, if you like, who were able to stay on in teaching. Yes, it was a little bit of a scenic route to try and get the children on board with their learning, but it was worth investing that time and energy to understand their points of view in order to then move on with their teaching and learning.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there is that it has the benefits of the students being empathized with. They're able to feel better maybe about themselves, that it supports their learning and their growth, having the attention, the empathy. And then it was also very constructive, very helpful for the teachers. So we're talking about a more empathic, the benefits of a empathic relationship in schools.
Exactly, it's a win-win situation, and we found this in so many other areas of the research. Head teachers themselves would say to us, we didn't even understand how powerful it would be. Getting the information and listening to our learners actually benefited us, the curriculum, the well-being of everybody concerned. So it has mental health implications as well. I think empathy is a tool that empowers. It obviously helps with your social skills and your emotional skills, and it empowers in that sense. But it makes the learner in these cases move on as well with their learning.
So how did your studies continue then? When were those studies done?
So the one I mentioned with the teachers, these have all been done since 1998, so the late 90s. All the way through to the present day, culminating in the one you mentioned at the outset. So yeah, I mean, whereas they weren't necessarily directly focusing on empathy, I could see this sort of undercurrent of a theme going on that seemed to go all the way through, and it was all about the best results came from listening, and I do advocate just the term listening, just being able to listen to people, to understand where they're coming from. I think it's a force in its own right, as empathy is. And it's something we should all do as parents and as teachers. And when we don't listen, I mean, I feel when I say this, it's not rocket science, but often I think, maybe it's things that we need to be reminded of from time to time, because we do forget. We move on with our lives, and then it's being reined in to understand that these concepts, just the mere fact of listening, and that if a child or anybody says something, they're saying it for a reason, and they need to be heard at any age, especially arguably those early ages when children need to discover who they are. So the importance of parents and teachers listening to the young people, giving them credit and valuing them as a person, I would say has repercussions for their development, for their mental health. And I mean, I'm making it sound very dramatic, and in a way it is, because by, you know, if I listen to you, and you feel that I value what you say, then that's clearly going to have an impact in how you develop. Well, maybe not me personally, but you as a person, as it were. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty sold. I got my empathy T-shirt, you know, the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. So been really, I see all those benefits that you're talking about. And when I came across the concept or the experience of it, I thought, wow, this is really important. This is, the world sort of needs to raise the empathy level of our whole culture, really. So yeah.
I totally agree. And I see you've got We Listen. And that listening thing, it really is important. And taking a little bit of time, because often as human beings, we're so-called cognitively busy, and we don't have time, you know, to take the time sometimes we think. Although actually, take a little bit of time and it will reap rewards in the future. You know, it's like those teachers who
right.
spent engaging with the pupils. Yes, it took time, and some of them really went round the houses in order to sort of think about those pupils' lives, and outside the science lesson even, they really took time in order to engage them and understand them, and that really reaps dividends. It really is powerful.
Yeah, you hear a lot of time, oh, there's just no time for this. We have to, you know, get to have the material and so it's really taking that time I think for the long term, it really pays off. If you look at the amount of, because all those problems and stresses and strains don't get resolved, they just get carried forward. So
absolutely, they will only accumulate, and it is just taking the time as parents, as teachers, as people in general, just to listen to what other people are trying to tell you, to give them, yeah, absolutely, to give them the time to listen.
Well, the kind of the work that I built on was the work of Carl Rogers, so he had talked about empathy, the importance of empathy in education, like back in the 60s and 70s, saying it's very rare that you have the full manifestation of an empathic stance. And he said this would be quite transformational. He didn't use a transformational, but you know, that it was just a sort of a shortage of it. And so I don't know, have you looked at his work? And
absolutely, I'm familiar with Carl Rogers, yes, psychotherapist, and I just think, yes, a lot of what, and as you say, this is not new. What we're talking about is not new. It's like I said before, I feel we need to be reminded in different stages of, you know, history of our lives that keep doing this, and it's something as well that should be used, you know, dynamically between people on a regular basis, because it helps our understanding of other people's perspectives. I would say it would lower prejudices, it decrease any of that going on, because we'd understand more where people are coming from, and it's just such a powerful concept, and it's something that we have found when children are exposed to it in various guises, and as in the latest study that I've done, are even taught it. They really savor it, they understand it, and they value it, and they want it, and they find it's a very valuable tool. And in this case, it actually led to designing a really powerful outcome. So yeah, I think it's extremely powerful.
Okay, so you were studying the benefits of empathy for students, you know, children being heard. So it has all those benefits. It has the benefits of teachers. If they're listening, they're feeling maybe more connected and maybe less stressful themselves. So it has the benefit. And then, I mean, then you've moved into empathy and creativity. It sounds like you're kind of making the case that empathy and creativity are related. I mean, that's, as I understand, your paper or study was about that.
Exactly. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It ticks all those boxes you just mentioned. You know, it helps from everybody's perspective, and especially for the teacher in the classroom that's trying to communicate and get through. You know, if you can afford children with this special power, and they can get it, by the way, through so many means. So there's there's an organization called Empathy Lab, where children are reading books and getting and understanding empathy through reading. So it's those resources allowing them to do that. But in this study, what we did was, and as you said, empathy and creativity, I think they are similar concepts, constructs, because I would say empathy does take a bit of imagination, and it's projecting your imagination into somebody else's space and trying to understand that space, trying to understand where they're coming from. So in that sense, I would say it's a fairly creative construct in its own right.
Mm-hmm.
But what this study was doing was it was in the design and technology classroom, trying to put in place a way of teaching creativity to children in order that they can produce a product bearing in mind the user's needs. So clearly you need empathy in order to understand the user's needs. So it was to do with children who, they were year 9 children, so about 14 years of age, for example, who were then asked to design an asthma treatment for children under 6, so a treatment to relieve asthma. And we gave them this task, but in order to help them with the task, the Faculty of Education, in alliance with the engineering department, created a kit called Designing Our Tomorrow. And it's a very powerful kit that enables children to be able to wear props, to understand what it's like to be somebody else, maybe with arthritis. So very difficult to open certain things if your hands are very rigid with arthritis, for example. So children were taught through this kit. And then they were charged with the task of solving this asthma treatment for young children. And they had to put themselves in the shoes, literally, well, not literally, but metaphorically, of the children, but also stakeholders. So the parents, the nurses, the teachers around the children. So if that child was going to have an asthma attack, how would those other people around them respond, and what would they need? And incredibly, the children just grabbed this task. They were so, the results were very powerful. One child, I just need to read this, said, "We were very creative. I never knew that was inside me, and I want it to be like that every day."
Wow.
And I just thought that was really powerful. And what this study did was it brought out dimensionality, I would say, within these children, of something they almost never knew they had, but not only felt good, but also enabled them to create this task in hand. And one of our youngsters actually came out with a winning design, which the NHS is now going to run with for asthma treatment in young children. So not only can empathy be taught in that respect, it can actually get results. And at the same time, it can empower these young learners to realize that they can use this skill to benefit others and themselves, I would say, because I think it has an impact on your mental health and your well-being, knowing that you have the faculty, the facility to do this type of thing.
Well, there's a couple of things that are coming up for me. One is about the definition. How are you sort of defining empathy? I've interviewed for Dan Batson, for example, and he's laid out like 8 ways, at least, that the word empathy is used. So to get a little bit, clear on how you're using the term.
Sure. I mean, within the study, but also the way I define it mostly, I see empathy, broadly speaking, containing 2 constructs. There's the affective side, or the more emotional type of empathy, and there is the cognitive side, or the perspective taking side. So it's a multifaceted construct, and we empathize with others with one or more of these 2 aspects of it. So I could empathize with you in a very emotional way, and typically if I've experienced something that you're going through, then perhaps I'm more likely to use that more emotional, affective type of empathy to literally almost experience what you're experiencing. So I'm basically feeling with you, as it were, for this particular scenario. On the other hand, I could also empathize in a more cognitive thinking, more detached, you might say, way, which is understanding what you're going through, but not necessarily feeling the pain or the suffering or the pleasure or whatever it is that you're actually feeling. And that's perfectly doable. And there's both are empathy. They can exist together, they can exist separately. One potentially could follow the other. So if I feel affectively, emotionally along with you, then maybe my understanding will then follow, or vice versa. I can understand something and that will lead to a more emotional response. So, and depending who we are as human beings and our, I want to say, how we've grown up, our parenting, maybe if we suffer from, if we're on a spectrum of autism or psychological disorders of any kind, then we're more or less able to empathize. Mm-hmm. So that is, yes, in a nutshell.
Okay, well, let me share how I'm kind of looking at the term. There's an empathy of sensing into someone's experience, and I sort of base that on what I've understood as Carl Rogers' empathy. Like he would sit with someone and listen to them and sort of sense into who they are, what feelings are arising, what their experience is, and just sort of being present with that. And he would use active listening or empathic listening, kind of reflecting back his understanding to get more of an accurate sense. Like perhaps the person is like very angry, okay, I'm sensing your anger, you're sensing their anger. And then, maybe then after you listen to them for a while, you can sense that anger could just melt away and you just sort of feel their maybe loneliness or something, or, arising. So and then in the therapeutic sense, you're listening for maybe an hour to the person, sort of accompanying them on their inner journey, kind of their exploration. You can sort of feel into it. It's not that if they're angry that I become angry too, kind of, state matching, but that I'm staying present with them. I sort of sense a little bit, maybe it's mirrored a little bit, but I'm not sort of like overwhelmed with sensing into who they are. So how are you seeing that in terms of your definition?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that sounds like a very powerful way of trying to understand somebody's problem. So what you're suggesting and describing is that I will empathize with you, and this is quite characteristic of the more sort of counseling psychology, psychoanalytic perspectives of treatment, of therapy. And what it is, it's me feeling, to a degree, as you say, not fully, but really trying to get so far in terms of understanding and feeling the person's situation in order then to understand it and in order to try and do something about it. And yes, I think that can be very powerful. And particularly, I would say, when you yourself haven't experienced a certain scenario, but you're really trying to empathize by putting yourself in the shoes of the other person through them telling you what they've experienced and their issues. I think that can be a very, very powerful force, because you go, as I said, a certain direction in understanding and feeling, but as you also said, you don't let it completely immerse you fully, so that maybe then you are completely almost helpless in then trying to help. So empathy has this extra dimension to it, I would say, which is also the helping, the pro-social, the altruistic side of it. And you don't therefore want it to kind of swamp your emotions so much so that then you're overwhelmed and can't do anything about the task in hand, the person in front of you in this case. So I think that's a really nice balance of trying to understand enough in order then to hopefully try and help that person.
Yeah, that's sort of the Carl Rogers. He would not even kind of help per se. It was the empathic connection that was the constructive, positive force. It's kind of like you're saying the children, when the children are heard and seen, right, and the attention is paid to them, is they kind of grow sort of on there's something about it, that feeling of connection kind of helps their personal development. And so in that model, he wouldn't say, well, I'm going to give you, this advice or something. In fact, he was seeing advice as something that might even, kind of block the presence. So
I think you're absolutely, that word advice wouldn't be the word, but you're absolutely right. And it was my listening thing earlier, even just by listening and trying to understand that person, what that's doing is it's showing them you're spending the time trying to invest in them and their issues and what they're bringing to you. But you're affording them the time and space through listening, through trying to engage. And absolutely, as with young children, if we as parents, we as teachers take time to listen to them, rather than either brush them off or ignore them, that's all they need. It's just taking the time to listen. You might not be able to understand me fully, but I'm worthy of being listened to. And the fact that you're spending that time listening to me, and in the Carl Rogers scenario as well, helps me because it means that I can explain my scenario with you as well, trying to reach me. So it's almost like you're meeting this person almost midway or a bit more perhaps, but they're being able to talk because you're listening in an engaging, empathic way. Absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe it's that listening and being heard. You kind of go into your own self. It's sort of like a self-empathy for the person being heard and listened to. They're sensing into themselves because they're sharing themselves. And then if they come across a problem by being heard, it gives a space for that creative new solutions to whatever that problem is to happen. So that's sort of that connection to creativity is being heard and seen creates a space. There's maybe some kind of a warmth, maybe it's the oxytocin or whatever, creates a sense of safety for new creative stuff to come up.
I think you're totally right. I think the safety, I think there's validation then from the person being listened to, that you're investing time in me, I'm telling you my thoughts, and you are then affirming that I'm not completely off track. And so then that obviously then encourages more conversation. And so it's that combination of listening, of conversation, of empathy, which is the listening as well, but all those things all wrapped into one that I think makes for a wonderful formula, and then allows people to absolutely, to express themselves. And the same with children at young ages, being able to address the needs by just listening and allowing those children to do what they want and how they want to do it, and having an impact on their development as a consequence.
Yeah, it's nice to kind of articulate kind of the dynamics that are happening, be able to, put that into words and describe it so that others can sort of follow the dynamics of the benefits of empathy. Because, I've interviewed so many different people on empathy that it's a bit of a mess, the definitions. It's like you never know what people are talking about. So for example, there's this book out against empathy. You might have heard it, Paul Bloom, but his definition, for example, would be if you go to a therapist or whatever, and the therapist is listening to you, or the person is listening to you, and you get really angry, I'm so angry, or I'm in terrible tears, that you mimic, you mirror, you become totally angry or totally in tears, right? And for me, that's not even empathy. That's sort of like state matching or sympathy, or, there's a lot of other reasons that you state match. And that actually blocks the empathy because I'm no longer staying present with you to sort of sense into, I'm kind of in my own detached kind of world with my own anger or something like that. So it's like, there's so much we're talking about, like, in terms of what he's saying, I actually kind of agree that actually that's actually what he's calling empathy is actually for me a block to empathy. So it's kind of, it's quite frustrating.
As you say, I mean, yes, what he's talking about is like a mirror reaction. It's like your mirror neurons in your brain. They would be doing what you've just described. They'd be firing, but as from the outside, we as humans can kind of contain that, if you like. we can still immerse ourselves in other people's experiences, either, as I said, more emotionally or more cognitively, or both. But it doesn't have to become a kind of chaotic response, because, as you said, if we were to then, I'm thinking about as the adult to a child, respond in that way when a child is in distress, that in no way would help the child. That would be the opposite. They would want, maybe consolation or listening or some form of calm, rather than anything necessarily that they're going through and reflecting an erratic response. So yeah, absolutely. I think the definitions do range, as you say, with what empathy actually is.
Yeah, so it's like if the child is upset, it's like you sense a little bit of the upsetness, you feel into it, but you still have a sense of empathic presence, empathic space to sense into it. Oh, you're really feeling, upset. Tell me about that. Well, I feel upset because they took my popsicle or something. And I've heard that story from my own nephews and nieces, like, they took my popsicle and I'm all angry.
Exactly. And of course, and that situation in its own right, of course, for that child, it is distressing. And for an adult, then you realize, you can actually contain this. You can actually explain it. You can actually, first by listening to what's happened, rather than sort of clamping down and then brushing the child aside, saying it's not an issue. It's a popsicle, but it's still an issue for the child. So it's, understanding the distress. Because for me, I feel that whichever way you respond to that, either by saying, don't be silly, it's just a popsicle, what are you worrying about? See, that to me tells the child that, well, you're not valuing them. They're not worthy to be given the time of day, because for them that is important. So taking the time, therefore, to even understand that scenario, and I'd argue it would take even less time to resolve it through doing this, just by listening, by saying, that's a shame, why do you think they've done that? Trying to get them to understand themselves even why that person will have done that. So teaching them empathy in turn. But also, I think, as well as an adult, reflecting it onto yourself. I think something that Philippa Perry says, psychoanalyst, that we should maybe then say to the child, how do you think I would feel if this is, so that we don't point the finger too much at them. Then we're actually saying, what about me? How do you think I would feel in this scenario? So it distances them a little bit, so they don't feel too, that the finger isn't pointed too much in their direction, as it were. So things can be resolved in a very, I would say, in very sensible ways, and in ways that if you do, then and doing it the right way will certainly, as I keep saying, I know, but have an impact on their development as well, and how they see themselves, and developing as a confident individual, because that person has taken the time to invest and listen and empathize with them. Therefore, I feel I'm a valued individual. I'm going to have resilience. I'm going to grow up with, hopefully, a good level of mental health and well-being, and I'm not going to fall into a learned, so-called, what we call in psychology, learned helplessness type of situation, where I know people don't seem to value me early on in life, therefore probably they won't ever value me, because that's the mindset I'm going to stick with, unfortunately. So taking that time to explain about the popsicle and to make them understand, for example, I say has huge repercussions.
Yeah, for their whole life, you're setting patterns for a whole life for that child, instead of kind of dismissing it. What I'm hearing, instead of dismissing it, say this isn't important, why are you upset, forget being upset. You're kind of being there, being present, hearing what the meaning is for that child, and kind of having, and then when they can sort of explore it, they can maybe come up with some kind of resolutions or creative solutions to the problem.
Perfect. And we're not saying, as you said, complete spoon feeding. It's just guiding them, knowing that you're giving them the time to understand them, and then perhaps coming up with suggestions. But so what we're talking about is the classic authoritative parenting, which is a parenting that has boundaries, but where children are allowed to explore, versus more authoritarian parenting, where I'm just going to shut you down because this incident is really not of importance. And to the child, they will internalize it as meaning, therefore, perhaps I'm not very important either. And yeah, so.
Well, this was a real example with my nephews and nieces, right? So my niece had taken the popsicle from my nephew. He was like totally upset and was like, went to bed and wouldn't talk to anybody. He was so upset. But I did that empathic listening, like you're talking. And then the niece came, but I listened to her too about what's going on for you. Why did this happen? And then I got them to do empathic listening with each other. So I think that's the trick, is that the people in conflict, or be it children or whoever, are able to listen to, and we use the active listening with each other, and I kind of help support that. And then they actually kind of worked it out. Then the niece said, well, I'll make you a new popsicle. And they came to a solution, and suddenly his tears kind of ended, and they jumped up and they were happy, and they ran off together as best friend, brother and sister, best friends. So it's that getting the dialogue and having some tools for that, mutual, dialogue, I think, is what we're kind of focusing on.
Totally that. You're absolutely right. And allowing that space for both sides, if you like, I want to say the guilty party and the non-guilty party, both, to understand why they did what they did and why the other person did what they did. So just understanding people's responses and, their reactions to certain events. And by understanding that, and like I said earlier on, understanding the situation around the person, and not just making a dispositional so-called attribution and making an attribution error in turn, but actually taking into account the situation that has surrounded that person, that has made them do a certain thing, can absolutely, if you like, it can form an epiphany for people, and it can empower them because they suddenly understand what's going on. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. So the other part in terms of definitions I want to jump into was, you had said, how would I feel, or how would the other person feel? And I don't know, what are you calling that in terms of empathy? Like I've been calling that imaginative empathy, that you can role take any position or any person. Excuse me. Sorry.
You're okay.
I got a little cough.
Okay. Yes.
So what are you calling that? That's role taking. What?
The role take. I think you're referring to the perspective taking, the more cognitive. So
right.
I would call it more the thinking, the cognitive, understanding why that person is doing a certain thing. But you're right in the sense that when, for example, the children in the study that we've just conducted, they were also asked to role play the people involved in the asthma treatment.
Oh wow! Mm-hmm. Cool.
So the nurse, the parents, the teachers, and in order for them to literally step into the shoes and understand what it was that was going on in those people's minds when that young child has an asthma attack, and what they need in turn in order to equip themselves to resolve this problem. So we actually got the children to role play as well, which was a very powerful thing to do, because they stepped into those. So, not necessarily feeling and affective and emotional, but really stepping into the shoes to understand the perspectives of those people.
Yeah, this is my problem with the terms. Like I know that's the cognitive empathy. I think that a better term would be imaginative empathy, because you're imagining yourself in the role of something, And then you're sensing your own felt experience in that role, sort of like an actor. And that's what those tools, when you have the, you have the things, the props that make you feel older, or they even have something called the empathy belly, right? That men can wear this belly that makes you feel, what it's like to be pregnant, or, so, and there's these sort of props. There's glasses you can wear that make you sense what it's like to have glaucoma or various, so you're sort of sensing into it and you're feeling into that role. So it seems to me, and then also in mediation, like I do conflict mediation, that you can have someone take the role of someone else and sense into it. So you can say, oh, if there's a family issue and the father was, being angry, somebody can take that role and play that role and sense into it and have the emotions that would be in that role come up. So, I mean, is that sort of what you're considering cognitive empathy? Because it seems to me it's really much more about imagination and sensing into the felt experience of.
I actually agree. I mean, you could certainly call it imagination. Imagination involves, obviously, it's cognitions. It's a very executive functioning type of skill, and we need it in creativity as well. That's why when you said empathy and creativity, yes, they go hand in hand very much because of the imagination and creativity. And from what you're saying now, you feel is more of an imaginative process in empathy, which, yes, absolutely. Maybe we should give it more credit and call it imagination. And it's also what, as I mentioned, the study by Jane Elliott in her classroom in 1968, decided she was going to split the class down the middle, and the blue-eyed children would be the persecutors, and the brown-eyed children will be the persecuted, if you like. And it was to do with teaching children, putting them into the shoes of people who were either discriminated against or those who were the discriminators. And by doing that, by imagining themselves into these people, into these shoes of the people in the classroom, and either feeling discriminated against or being discriminators, they then understood what prejudice was all about. So very powerful, as you say, projecting yourself, imagining yourself into the roles, maybe using props, maybe not using props, but whatever helps. We definitely found that using props in this study helped children understand what it was like. And yes, we had the glasses that made you understand what it was like for people over the age of certain ages who needed glasses to be able to read, and therefore, and the gloves that helped them understand what it was like to have arthritis as an older person in an aging population, and how we should design for our older people when we're thinking about designing certain things. So yeah, I think that imagination is very important, and it has been used. That word has been used alongside the cognitive and perspective taking, because it is projecting yourself in an imaginative way into somebody else.
I think it's a sexier term than cognitive. I think the cognitive was a bunch of cognitive academics probably came up with that term. If we called it imaginative empathy, I think more people would be interested. It's kind of, is it?
We need to give it a different name than anything to be able to sell it. Absolutely.
So anyway, so tell me more about your study, like what you learned about the the empathy and creativity.
Well, what was very interesting about the study was that we had two groups of children in this same year group. Half the year continued with their normal design and technology lessons, where they didn't have this intervention, where they didn't have the task of making an asthma treatment for young children. They just carried on with their normal design and technology lessons. And part of this came about as well, by the way, because we want in schools in the UK at least to be able to change the way we teach design and technology. We want to make it a bit more imaginative, interesting, creative, not just sort of bashing out the same old keyring that children make, albeit in different colors. Something a bit more creative for our designers and engineers of the future. So whereas some of the year nines continued with their normal design and technology lessons. The other half were given the task of creating an asthma treatment for young children using empathy instruction kit called Designing Our Tomorrow. And what we did find was that by the end of the academic year, the children who were involved in the empathy in designing for the asthma treatment, their creative empathy, which was measured using a psychometric measure called the Torrance test of creative thinking, their creative empathy levels rose significantly from the start of the year to the end of the year. We also found, which was very interesting, although not quite significant in the findings, but in the words of the children, it came out very clearly that girls and boys benefited in different ways, such that boys benefited from that emotional empathy I mentioned earlier, the more affective empathy, the one where typically you might say boys of that age are less encouraged to sort of promote because it's not such a sort of manly thing to perhaps exhibit, but they took on board the more emotional empathy instruction, and their emotional empathy scores were much greater at the end of the school year than they had been at the beginning. And for girls, the more perspective-taking, imaginative, cognitive empathy was greater. So what is interesting there is, I want to say, the kind of stereotypes, I'm very generalizing a lot here, that we have though in the classroom, where sometimes girls doing science are sometimes overshadowed by boys who feel themselves, who sort of muscle in on the science subjects potentially more than girls. That again, I'm generalizing, but where girls are given the remit to think imaginatively, cognitively, and in that sense, they make great strides. And this is what this actually allowed them to do. And likewise for the boys, saying that, to engage with someone emotionally is socially acceptable, for them, again, ended up, showing great results because they were able to latch onto that emotional empathy, incorporated in their designs, and by the end of the year had these much higher empathy creativity scores as measured with that psychometric measure I mentioned.
So what do you think is the dynamic that is happening? It's like, where is that creativity sort of released? Like, what is sort of happening where those creative senses are happening?
So I think a few things, and we mentioned it earlier. It's when, firstly, I would say it's giving the children the time space to actually say to them, we value you enough to want you to solve this very important life-threatening problem. You give someone a task where they are shown to be valued, that in itself, I think, is of huge importance. It's, I'm valued to do this, me, and I'm going to do this for you. So that in its I think is in its own sense helped hugely. Secondly, the fact that we had this incredible kit called Designing Our Tomorrow that introduced children to what empathy is, to how to go about doing it and understanding another person's perspective and the person you are designing for, and how to get into their shoes in order to design the best product for them. So this combination of empowering children with that independence and freedom to then design something, and giving them the space and the time, that space and time again, where when we empathize with someone, we need to sit back for a little while and understand. And that's what we gave them, and they in turn showed it. So I feel it's kind of almost like a contagious, not to be too dramatic, a type of behavior, really, where we're giving them that space to do something important. They're being valued there, and they understand they're being valued doing it. And to give a bit of instruction that helps them with it through this kit, then led to resolving through their designs, their wonderful designs, this wonderful treatment. So it was it just worked from start to finish for them and was very powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, with the design, we're talking about like human-centered design or design thinking. Is I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area, so Silicon Valley, Stanford has a design school. IDEO is centered there. They were a real leader in the whole design thinking process. So they've made a big point about the design process. So if you design anything, that their process is first you have to empathize with the people you want to design for, right? So you had different the kit for you, so you can kind of sense, you have the goal of who you're designing for, and then you need to sense into what are they feeling, what's their experience like, and then you start with empathy. So they've really put empathy as like a first step gateway to the whole design process. And then you sort of gather your material where you kind of focus in on a specific problem, then you kind of open it up to creative thinking. You get a whole field of creative ideas, and then you sort of sort it down to some that you want to create a prototype with. And then you create the prototype, and then you go and test it, right? So and then when you test it, you're empathizing in depth again to see how does this work, and you just keep iterating on the process. So is that sort of what were you using that?
It's not sort of, it's exactly it.
That's
Perfect. So what you've just explained is, firstly, the starting point is always empathy. You stop and you listen and you understand from whichever viewpoint. But what you've just described is what we absolutely advocate, which is explore, create, evaluate. And there's iterations of these in the design process. So we're exploring through empathy, through understanding and listening. But also exploring just generally regarding the type of product I might then produce. Then I start creating this product because I have empathized and understood the needs of the user. And then I will evaluate it to see, well, does it work? Let me try it out and see whether it will work as a thing. But then I will do it various iterations of that. So I'll go around again and I will explore, create, evaluate. And this is what the children were doing until they reached this amazing, the conclusion where they were at the product stage where they felt this is it and this is going to work. And so I think it's incredible. It's great training for anybody, certainly for designers, but anybody generally. I think it's the way we as humans should be thinking, even in terms of just interacting with other people. Just explore, create, and evaluate generally.
Well, in the IDEO model, they're very explicit about. They use the word actually empathy instead of explore, right. So it's very explicitly about empathy, and it's also, I've seen it's sort of you're bringing it into the schools here, at least in the United States. Like in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's like over 30, 40 schools that we're implementing, probably a lot more by now. So it's actually being taught. So it seems like it's this model is almost sort of the next generation of education. I don't know if you have that experience in the UK, that what you're talking about is like a new experiential learning model that's really spreading.
So, well, I hope that is the case. What I'm seeing much more now, well, firstly, the concept of empathy is talked about much more in schools, but actually that it should almost be present throughout the curriculum and the school day in some shape or other. So not only in the design and technology class, where it's clearly useful for understanding the needs of the user and therefore engaging, in that sense, but in other subjects across the curriculum. So as a concept, so through that reading literature I mentioned earlier, it's a powerful force that can be disseminated, that children can read about through literature, fiction, and can understand what it means and internalize it and use it for their own needs through understanding, for example, characters in literature, but from using it in design, for engineering, for example, and using it in so many other sort of areas of of the curriculum, yeah, absolutely, and the school day itself, as well as talking about it as a concept in its own right and discussing it in, we have lessons called PSHE, but where you can actually talk about such concepts and understand what they are.
I want to keep us on time, but do you have like 10 minutes or so extra here? Or
Yes, I can, yeah.
I could talk hours with you.
Oh, me too.
This is an amazing, it's an amazing discussion. Just tell me if you need to end at some point.
No, that's
okay. So, so what I'm hearing is it's really what I really support is in a school is spreading empathy in the whole culture, right? It's really to be sort of part of the culture, be it in the design, be it in reading, being it, and maybe the relationships, how, you know, the students are learning these relationships, more empathic relationships between themselves and the teachers. And you know, I've done a lot with design, you know, I've done a bunch of design, but I've sort of stepped back to building on Carl Rogers' empathic listening. So what we do is like small groups, we call them empathy circles. So we have like 4 people in a circle, you know, with a topic, and we use empathic listening. So one person, you know, selects who they're going to speak to. They share and they get a reflection, empathic reflection, you know, from that person. And then they share some more and get a reflection, and we have a time limit. And then after they're done speaking for maybe 5 minutes and getting reflections, then the listener chooses who they're going to speak to, and they speak to them, and it kind of goes, and we go for like 2 hours doing this empathic listening. And have you done any kind of active listening kind of work in the schools? I'm just wondering if you've...
I mean, not so much active listening like that. The listening I mentioned earlier, which is all to do with pupil voice. So listening to pupils in order to understand their perceptions of their learning, their relationships at school and the impact on their learning. So over the years, we've researched in all these areas, and that's been active listening. And it's active listening to pupils and them knowing that you are actively listening for a certain purpose and because you're invested in them and interested in them. But also, and that is great. I think all these things are great, but I think more than that, it's almost something that we should be doing almost without almost thinking. And arguably, you know, if as parents, adults, teachers, we raise children by listening, by being empathic, they in turn will just do it. So it's introducing it at the very, very early. I mean, as I want to say, almost as soon as a child is born, you direct your attention and your empathic to them, because inevitably that way they will respond likewise. They will do the same thing, having been treated that way. I mean, there's classic experiment in developmental psychology where it's called the visual cliff, where there's a baby on one end of this apparatus, which is half of it is covered and looks very safe to cross. The other half looks a bit precarious. It looks like a sheer drop, but it's not. The baby can crawl across it. But with the mother on the other side, looking at the baby, and depending on the gestures and the facial expressions that she uses, the baby will either cross or not cross. So if the mother is looking very encouraging, as if to say it's fine, you can cross, the baby will understand that it's safe to cross and understand those emotions that are being shown. Whereas if the mother's looking very fearful and anxious, the baby's less likely to cross, showing that we understand, we take on these emotions and how people respond to us very early, and we react to them and respond to them accordingly in turn. And so what I think this shows is how people respond to us early on, how much time they give us within their listening for us and for our situations, and allow us to explore and play and find our true selves, as, for example, Winnicott would say in psychoanalysis, then that in turn will boost our resilience, our self-esteem, our empathy, in turn. And in a way, I feel it's great you have these empathy circles, and it's good that we need this prompting. But if we have more of this going on at the very early age, introducing preschoolers, the concept just by acting in certain ways towards them in that authoritative style, but also maybe the reading materials that we read to them at those early ages, I feel it's something that can be inculcated in very young ages and continue throughout life, not needing potentially very much prompting.
Right.
But the prompts are there through what you do, through how we can teach, which is great as well.
Yeah, you're kind of wanting to get that mindset, that way of being. So this empathic way of being. So if parents already have that empathic way of being, that'll kind of, children just learn it through the presence and the modeling of it.
Absolutely. And it's shown very strongly through, yes, other areas of social psychology research as well. So, for example, social learning theory, we do as we are shown, and what we are shown is socially acceptable. And if we grow up feeling that what you're doing with me, this empathy stuff, is not only socially acceptable, but it's good for everyone concerned, then I'm going to perpetuate that type of behavior, and it can only be a good thing.
Yeah, the problem that I see is we have the culture as it is, right? We have to how do we get from where we are in the culture to that state? And it's kind of like, it's almost like we need crutches or something to kind of, to learn those skills. It's just that basic people listening to each other in general is already kind of, with our political dynamics is sort of in short supply. So it's kind of like, it's almost this empathic listening, these practices are sort of like a crutch to get us from sort of this general political dysfunction, cultural, problems that we have to that state. How do we get to that more empathic state to value that?
Well, and that's a really good question. And that's something that, absolutely, that people can be taught even at later ages. I mean, studies have shown that if I try and understand you from a more situational, as I mentioned, point of view, rather than more dispositional, I'm not pointing the finger at you, but I'm understanding the situation around you. And if we try and re-educate people from time to time, alerting them to the benefits of doing this, then you not only understand what's going on within a better picture, a fuller picture, but you're more empowered to do something about it, knowing why that person's behavior was the way it was. So I'm not just deciding that it's down to the fact that they're a rubbishy person. I've actually realized that something around in their situation has made them behave in such a way. And I think it's educating even adults to be able to do that from time to time. Because I think we do, as I said before, I think we're often too cognitively busy to take the time to understand what other people are doing and why they're saying or behaving in different ways.
Well, that's what the empathy circle does, is it creates that time and space, and you fully hear someone, but you have to hear them to their satisfaction before you sort of move on. And sort of a little bit like training wheels or a crutch, for having that sort of mindset. And I've done it with my nephews and nieces who, they're like 5 years old, 6 years old, and they get into a fight. And I said, okay, what do we do? And they say, we're going to have an empathy circle. And we sit down, they kind of listen to each other and do that empathic listening and reflection. So
nice.
Yeah.
And I think, as you say, it takes time. Clearly it takes time, but anything that is worth it, I think, takes time. And it's just, what it does, and these teachers I mentioned in our study where they did take time to engage with their learners, but they were the teachers that were more successful as teachers. They stayed on in teaching. It was more fulfilling as a career. Their well-being was better. The learners engaged and learned more. So it took time to connect and to understand, but actually it was worth that time spent. And yes, it can take us a bit longer, but in the end, it reaps dividends because of the time we've invested at the outset.
Well, that sounds like a good stopping point for this discussion. I hope we can continue. This has been absolutely fabulous to hear, about your studies, and it sounds like a rich, very rich, wealth of experience there around this topic.
I love it. So thank you very much for your time as well.